Good. You're back. Are you quite comfortable? Here is another story. When I was a medical student, I came across one or two very curious human beings. But there was one fellow I remember particularly, for he caused me the most vivid, and I think the most uncomfortable emotions I've ever known. For many months I knew Smith only by name, as the occupant of the floor above me. How he knew that I, a medical student, was interested in the study of languages was something I could never explain. But one day, quite unannounced, he came quietly into my room in the evening and asked me point-blank if I knew enough Hebrew to help him in the pronunciation of certain words. I was greatly flattered to be able to give him the desired information, but it was only when he thanked me and was gone that I realized I'd been in the presence of an unusual individuality. I do not mean that he deliberately suggested danger, but rather that he brought forces in his wake which automatically warned the nervous centres of my system to be on their guard and alert. What his occupation was during the day I never knew. I think he slept until the sun set. No one ever saw him on the stairs or heard him move in his room during the day. He was a creature of the shadows, who apparently preferred darkness to light. It so happened that about this time I was frequently called out at all hours of the night for the maternity cases, which a medical student takes at a certain period of his studies, and on returning from one of these visits at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was surprised to hear the sound of voices as I passed his door. A peculiar, sweet odour, too, not unlike the smell of incense, penetrated into the passage. I went upstairs very quietly, wondering what was going on there at this hour of the morning. To my knowledge, Smith never had visitors. For a moment I hesitated outside the door, with one foot on the stairs. The sound of voices was plainly audible, Smith's predominating so much that I never could catch more than points of sound from the other, penetrating now and then the steady stream of his voice. I heard rapid steps that seemed to end sometimes in stumbling, and quick, sudden movements that brought up with a violent lurching against the wall of furniture. As I listened to Smith's voice, I began to feel afraid. There was something in the sound that made me feel intuitively he was in a tight place, and an impulse stirred faintly in me, very faintly, I admit, to knock at the door and inquire if he needed help. But long before the impulse could translate itself into an act, or even before it had been properly weighed and considered by the mind, I heard a voice close beside me in the air, a sort of hushed whisper, which I am certain was Smith speaking, though the sound did not seem to have come to me through the door. It was close in my very ear, as though he stood beside me, and it gave me such a start that I clutched the banisters to save myself from stepping backwards and making a clatter on the stairs. "There is nothing you can do to help me," it said distinctly, "and you will be much safer in your own room." I am ashamed to this day of the pace at which I covered the flight of stairs in the darkness, and of the shaking hand with which I lit my candles and bolted the door. But there it is, just as it happened. One evening, while I was reading, the door of my room opened and Smith came in. He made no attempt at ceremony. He inquired if I was not the fortunate possessor of a very rare rabbinical treatise, which he named. How he knew that I possessed the book puzzled me exceedingly, but I was still more surprised to see him cross the room and take it out of my bookshelf almost before I had had time to answer in the affirmative. "I hope," he whispered, "I hope you are never disturbed at night." "Eh?" I stammered. Disturbed at night? No, thanks, at least not that I know of." "I'm glad," he replied gravely, appearing not to notice my confusion and surprise at his question. "But remember, should it ever be the case, please let me know at once." And he was gone, back to his room again. For some minutes I sat reflecting upon his strange behaviour. But then I was aroused from my reverie by the knowledge that someone was again in the room, standing close beside my chair. The room was utterly empty, at least to the eye, but to the nerves. There was a person standing there at my very elbow. A sensation of gigantic force and power came with it. I was conscious, even within a few moments, of a general drooping of the powers of life in the whole system, and a distinct approach of drowsiness and torpor, when there rose, in the distance as it were, a tremendous commotion. It was Smith, and his voice had not sounded for more than a few seconds when I felt something withdrawn from my presence, indeed from my very skin. It seemed as if there was a rushing of air, and some large creature swept by me at about the level of my shoulders. Instantly the pressure on my heart relieved, and the atmosphere seemed to resume its normal condition. What had happened, I do not know, only I was alone again, and my strength was returning as rapidly as it had left me. Very early next morning, somewhere about 3 o'clock, I was awakened by a curiously stealthy noise in the room. And the next minute, there followed a crash, as if all my books had been swept bodily from their shelf onto the floor. I jumped out of bed and lit the candle in a second, and then the first dazzle of the match, I was certain I saw a dark grey shadow, of ungainly shape, and with something more or less like a human head, drive rapidly past the side of the wall farthest from me, and disappear into the gloom by the angle of the door. All the books from what I called my language shelf were strewn across the floor. As I replaced them on the shelf and noted that not one was missing, I busied myself mentally with the sore problem of how the agent of this little practical joke had gained access to my room and then escaped again, for my door was locked and bolted. A knock at the door interrupted my reflections, and I gave a start. "Let me in," came in Smith's voice. I unlocked the door. He came in, fully dressed. His face wore a curious pallor. He closed the door behind him and came close up to me, uncomfortably close. "You should have called me at once," he said. I stammered something about an awful dream. The man fascinated me horribly for some reason. Why in the devil's name was he up and dressed at 3 a.m? "It's your amazing vitality that causes you this annoyance," he said. "That's the real attraction," he went on. "But if this continues, one of us will have to leave, you know." I positively could not find a word to say in reply. Then he was gone in a second, and I had closed and locked the door behind him. A week or two later, I was coming home between 2 and 3 a.m. from a maternity case, certain features of which for the time being had very much taken possession of my mind. I had already reached my own landing when I gave a violent start. I realized a voice had sounded close beside me in the air. "Help! Help!" It was accompanied by what I can only describe as a vivid, tactile hallucination. I was touched. The skin of my arm was clutched by fingers. Some compelling force sent me in a headlong rush as if the haunting forces of the whole world were at my heels. Smith's door yielded at once, and I burst into a room that was so full of choking vapour, moving in slow clouds, that at first I could distinguish nothing at all, but a set of what seemed to be huge shadows passing in and out of the mist. The carpet was rolled back and piled in a heap in the corner, and upon the white boards of the floor I noticed a large circle, drawn in black, of some material that emitted a faint glowing light and was apparently smoking. Inside this circle, as well as at regular intervals outside it, were curious-looking designs, also traced in the same black smoking substance. These, too, seemed to emit a feeble light of their own. My first impression on entering the room had been that it was full of people, but it was borne in upon me beyond the possibility of doubt that they were not human beings. Their proximity conveyed to my mind something that was quite terrible and overwhelming. I fell into a violent trembling. Then my eyes fell upon Smith. He was couching against the wall on my right, and it was plain he was in extremities. He wore the most resolute expression I've ever seen on a human countenance, and though for the moment at a fearful disadvantage, he looked like a man who had confidence in himself, and in spite of the working of fear was waiting his opportunity. "Help me back, quick, into that circle," I heard him half cry, half whisper. Knowing nothing of the forces I was dealing with, I had no idea of the deadly perils risked, and I sprang forward and caught him by the arms. He threw all his weight in my direction, and by our combined efforts his body left the wall and lurched across the floor towards the circle. Instantly, there descended upon us, out of the empty air of that smoke-laden room, a force which I can only compare to the pushing, driving power of a great wind, pent up within a narrow space. It was almost explosive in its effect, and it seemed to operate upon all parts of my body equally. It fell upon us with a rushing noise that filled my ears and made me think for a moment the very walls and roof of the building had been torn asunder. Under its first blow, we staggered back against the wall, and I understood plainly that its purpose was to prevent us getting back into the circle in the middle of the floor. Pouring with perspiration, and breathless, with every muscle strained to the very utmost, we at length managed to get to the edge of the circle, and at this moment, so great was the opposing force that I felt myself actually torn from Smith's arms, lifted from my feet, and twirled round in the direction of the windows as if the wheel of some great machine had caught my clothes and was tearing me to destruction in its revolution. But even as I fell, bruised and breathless against the wall, I saw Smith firmly upon his feet in the circle and slowly rising again to an upright position. By the power of his voice, behind which lay undoubtedly a genuine knowledge of the occult manipulation of sound, this man dominated the forces that had escaped from their proper sphere, until at length the room was reduced to silence and perfect order again. Smith, his face exceedingly white, but otherwise strangely composed, turned to me at once. "God, if you hadn't come, you deflected the stream, broke it up," he whispered. "You saved me." I quite forget how I got back to my own room, only know that I lay with 2 lighted candles for the rest of the night, and the first thing I did in the morning was to let the landlady know I was leaving her house at the end of the week. Smith still has my rabbinical treatise. At least, he did not return it to me at the time, and I have never seen him since to ask for it.